morning and welcome to the Venice Honganji Buddhist Temple's Fujinkai Memorial Service. My name is Linda Oshinobi and I am the 2024 Fujinkai Co-President along with Vicky Tokiya. Today we will be honoring the many Fujinkai members who have passed away over the years. This service is held in conjunction with the 96th Memorial of Lady Takeko Kujo, who founded the Fujinkai program and established its activities in the Honganji tradition. We are also holding this service in memory of Esshinni-sama and Kakushi-sama, wife and daughter of Shinran Shonin. The two women kept the memory and teachings of Shinran Shonin alive, so we may appreciate and learn from them today. Please join us in chanting Sanbutsuge, page 25 or 64.
Namandas, 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 namandas.
To the families and friends who have lost Fujinkai members, thank you for joining in today's service. As we read the members' names, please offer oshoko at any time during the reading.
Mrs. Koyu Taniyama, Mrs. Taki Nakamura, go ahead. Mrs. Yao Nakamura, Mrs. Kusako Nishihara, Mrs. Sumie Watari, Mrs. Hyoko Matsuda, Mrs. Tamayo Nakamura, Mrs. Yachio Mitsunaga, Mrs. Motome Okamoto, Mrs. Takeno Hamazawa, Mrs. Yuriko Kanemoto, Mrs. Sato Kanda, Mrs. Kikuyo Hata, Mrs. Shigeno Kuda, Mrs. Haruyo Shimoto, Mrs. Tomoe Omote,
Mrs. Nakako Morita, Mrs. Sayo Nakagiri, Mrs. Yukiko Takemoto, Mrs. Haru Fujimoto, Mrs. Shimano Furuya, Mrs. Hideo Hisamoto, Mrs. Namiko Yamaki, Mrs. Masuyo Nakao, Mrs. Haru Ozaki, Mrs. Osame Hojo, Mrs. Yoko Waki, Mrs. Setsuko Soyajima, Mrs. Bun Kishimoto, Mrs. Shizue Okubo, Mrs. Hisa Deguchi, Mrs. Miyoko Yumori, Mrs. Mary M. Yasuda, Mrs. Terumi Yamaoka, Mrs. Haruyo Ishikubo, Mrs. Misao Matsumoto, Mrs. Kiwayo Kujubu, Mrs. Kazue Doi, Mrs. Hanayo Inokuchi,
Mrs. Tomiko Morimasu, Mrs. Katsuko Kuda, Mrs. Yasue Yamada, Mrs. Takeko Sakaue, Mrs. Kame Nakamizo, Mrs. Kameyo Tsunoda, Mrs. Hatsue Takaki, Mrs. Matsuko Margo Noguchi, Mrs. Yasu Yamamoto, Mrs. Hatsuko Akioka, Mrs. Amy Okafuji, Mrs. Shigeko Lin Shimoka, Mrs. Miyuki Jean Waki, Mrs. Hideo Katayama, Mrs. Toshi Shishino, Mrs. Hatsue Some,
Mrs. Chiyoko Tanahiki, Mrs. Shigeko Fujihiro, Mrs. Shigeko Haraga, Mrs. Mary M. Kujubu, Mrs. Hisaye Nakagiri, Mrs. Fuiko Yamamoto, Mrs. Helen Toyoshima, Mrs. Akiko Tateishi, Mrs. Kyoko Kita, Mrs. Masako Morita, Mrs. Michika Ishii, Mrs. Teruko Oshige, Mrs. Masaye Kato, Mrs. Tomiko Maeda, Mrs. Aiko Yamada, Mrs. Mitsuye Imanishi, Mrs. Mei Izuhara, Mrs. Chieko Miyake, Mrs. Tamaye Tochioka, Mrs. Namuko Sasaki, Mrs. Akimi Maeda, Mrs. Emiko Fukuda, Mrs. Shizuko Matsubara,
Mrs. Aiko Kusaba, Mrs. Margaret Okoda, Mrs. Janet Ueda, Mrs. Kimi Igawa, Mrs. Nancy Nakagiri, Mrs. Yoshiko Morita, Mrs. Akiko Mitsui, Mrs. Janet Mitsui Brown, Mrs. Matsue Fujikato, Mrs. Yuriko Delia Kuwata, Mrs. Betty Shinmoto, Mrs. Trey Shiraki, Mrs. Yukiko Yumori, Mrs. Harue Ueki, Mrs. Velma Yoshida, Mrs. Chioko Uehara,
Mrs. Shirley Takeuchi, Mrs. Ethel Sato, Mrs. Yoshiko Udagawa, Mrs. Mitsuye Fukumoto, Mrs. Arlene Hamashita, Mrs. Ume Kita, Mrs. Mie Ino, Mrs. Cynthia Uehara, Mrs. Hiroko Morita, Mrs. Masayo Ueda, Mrs. Mary Nakagiri, Mrs. Kazuko Karamatsu, Mrs. Kei Masamitsu, Mrs. Toshi Ashikaga, Mrs. Ruth Midori Takahashi, Mrs. Sharon Kumoga, Mrs. Betty Matsumoto, Mrs. Michiko Yamashita, Mrs. Sumiko Tochihara, Mrs. Minako Iseda, Mrs. Mei Kumoga, Mrs. Nobue Masuda, and Mrs. Sachiko Ito. Please rise for our first Gatha, Seiya, which is page 63 in the ground service.
Thank you.
Gasho. Through the mystery of the nightly skies, the brightly lit stars shine to fill my heart with peace and joy. These many Buddhas, more than the sands that are found on the banks of the Ganges River, watching over us night and day, bring us joy and peace to my heart. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Reverend Kory will now introduce our special guest speaker for today's service.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to you all for coming today on this BWA Memorial Esshinni Takeko Kujo Kisaragi service. We have a really special guest today. Oh, you're not supposed to laugh. No, actually, you know what? Honestly, I don't know if any of you caught it, but for the first like 3 or 4 years, every time someone says sensei to me, I start laughing at them, so it's okay. Yeah. But no, let me read the bio first, and then yeah. Reverend Diana Thompson was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, where her family first encountered the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple. She was around 9 years old at the time, and has attended the temple ever since. Are you serious?
Yeah, for real.
No. Okay. It says she took her sweet time in college because she loves to learn, of course. Attending Metro State College of Denver, University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and the University of Colorado in Boulder. She studied sociology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, and finally landed on religious studies, which she got her official degree in from the University of Colorado in 2007. From there, she moved on to joint Masters of Arts program, studying for the ministry at the IBS and GTU in Berkeley. She began her studies there in 2008 while assisting at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple under the guidance of Reverend David Matsumoto. She received her Tokudo ordination in 2010 and graduated in May 2012. In August of 2012, she returned to Denver to work as a Tokudo assistant under the guidance of Reverend Ed Fuji at the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple. She received her Kyoshi ordination in December of 2012 and was conferred with her Kaikyoshi in 2013. She served the Denver Buddhist Temple until late March of 2021, when she went on a 2-year leave of absence. She returned to Denver Temple in March of 2023, serving alongside Reverend Nariaki Hayashi as the assistant minister. Reverend Thompson, or Thompson Sensei, and we missed paths. I mean, she was going out of IBS as I started. When she got her Kyoshi in 2012, that's when I got received my Tokudo. So you can see that it's, but because of that, I've known her as, when I first met Anne in Japan, I said that's where she gets her personality from. they light up the room. They're full of energy. I wish I could be like that all the time. And you guys know me. Anyways, but we're very grateful to have her here today, making the trip from Tri-State. A little envious that she was able to grow up at her home temple. I don't want to do that though. Or not grow up at your home temple, but go back to your home temple. Because some of you know I came from Gardena, but I really grew up at Nishi. That's too much. It's good that I'm here. I don't ever want to leave. Not that okay. But for she's very fortunate. Like Hirano Sensei, he's rounding out his career in the same at his home temple. Those are great ministers because they have to grow. I was just talking to Jimmy Ito yesterday because he was my LABCC counselor. I was his camper at 12 years old. He says, I don't know what to call you. Right? I said, well, whatever fits the occasion. So he says, he finally decided yesterday, after 8 years of being at this temple, I'll call you Reverend Kory at the temple, and outside the temple, I'll call you Kory. I said, whatever you want. Right? But that's the thing, is that she's going through that every day. Right? Since they see her as the 9-year-old, they see her as Reverend Diana Thompson. And again, grateful for the big personality, the light and energy, and then say, if this Nembutsu teaching teaches us something, that's a template that we want to live by. That big energy, that love for life. So with that, thank you again, Reverend Thompson and Ms. Ann, for coming today and joining us for this BWA Memorial weekend. And let's all give her a warm welcome. Thank you. You didn't mention Serenity.
Why not?
Yeah.
I'm a terrible person.
She has a daughter too that basically grew up. That's where I saw her is at IBS running around. She's now 20. She's almost 20 years old. So you could look at Anne and Diana and go, how could Anne be a grandmother, or how could Diana be a mom of a 20-year-old? But anyways, yeah, I was like, wait, that's a big part of your life.
And she lives in another state, so.
Out of sight, out of mind.
All right, thank you, Kory Sensei, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. My mom told me all about being able to travel with some of you in Japan, and she had such a great time that I could not wait to meet all of you. So thank you, I guess, essentially, for inviting my mother and letting me come along. So thank you very much. So, all right, we'll open with Kansho. Lacking even small love and small compassion, I cannot hope to benefit sentient beings. Were it not for the ship of Amida's vow, how could I cross the ocean of painful existence? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Again, so as we all know, today we are gathered for the BWA Memorial, which does honor Esshinni-sama, Kakushi-sama, and Lady Takeko Kujo, who are the women that sort of brought our BWA organization together. And in thinking about the BWA, again, as Reverend Kory mentioned, I grew up in the temple at Denver. And so I'm familiar with the BWA. And again, as Reverend Kory mentioned, it's an interesting place to be because I remember being very small and having the BWA ladies kind of shoo me out of the kitchen. And then I came back as a minister, still they shoo me out of the kitchen. Sensei, go sit down, you don't have to be. So I'm never allowed in the kitchen. I don't know what is happening there. But within all of that is something that always I think about when I think about the BWA is the concept of Dharma, or selfless giving. because the organization started as a service organization. To this day, the BWA is kind of the backbone of the temple. They help with everything. And as new ministers, we were always told, and then we pass this on to other ministers as they come up, if you want to succeed at your temple, make sure that you are in good with your BWA. Because if you're not, I don't even want to think about what's there. So when we talk about Dana, the word in Japanese is fusei, and it's translated as giving, generosity, or charity. And this concept is the first of the 6 perfections, and is also translated as selfless giving or perfect giving. Now, there are several different kinds of giving that we talk about within Buddhism, and when we talk about it as the practice of the lay people, people who are not monks or nuns, we talk about it as donations. So we give our time, we give our money, we give food, clothing to the monks in other traditions. And this is so that they can continue with their own practice of seeking enlightenment. And other gifts traditionally have been things like building the temples or erecting stupas, even painting Buddhist images in other traditions has been a form of giving to the monks and the nuns. And even today, when we do things like bring the food and the flowers for our onaijin, that is part of that whole tradition of giving. And in some traditions, when they talk about it, it's sort of supposed to produce some prosperity or get better rebirths in the next life. But for us, obviously, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, it's kind of a way for us to wean ourselves of various attachments. So the idea that even when we put rice on our own butsudan at home, first thing in the morning, the idea is that we are giving something as our first act of the day rather than taking it for ourselves. So that when we take it down and if we eat it, we can be reminded of this idea of giving. So we obviously also do not have monks or nuns in this tradition. So the support that we give to the temples goes to support the entire Sangha. It's not just the ministers. Our donations of money, our donations of time, our donations of food are all acts of dana. And they enable us to hear and receive the Dharma is the point of that. So this sort of leads back to the idea of what is selfless giving. Selfless giving is this idea that you are giving without any sort of expectation. And this is a perfect giving, which can be very difficult. And within Buddhist tradition, the idea of perfect giving is not exactly something that's required of the lay people, because even though dana is meant for us to try to be selfless in our giving, to try to be perfect, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we know that we are only human beings, and that perfection is very difficult for us. So we understand that when we are giving, we try to do it without attachment, but attachment is a hard thing for us to get rid of. Again, Shinran Shonin often talked about us as foolish beings, imperfect beings, and this is solely compared to the idea of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. We live very human lives, and so again, this striving for perfection that a lot of people do is something that actually can cause us more troubled states of mind. Now, monks and nuns, of course, in other traditions, they are not perfect, but they have done something that lay people in Jodo Shinshu we don't often do, and even the ministers do not do, is sort of removing themselves from what we would call regular life. Their job is to learn and to study the Dharma, but they do not get married, they do not have families, they do not have jobs. It's a huge job studying the Dharma all the time and giving talks, but they don't have the same experience. And so for them, their lives are a little bit different. And the selfless giving in Buddhism that monks and nuns give, and to a small extent the ministers in our tradition, is the gift of the Dharma. So when lay people are giving to temples, they are doing it to support the monks and nuns on their journey. And then the job of monks and nuns, and even the job of us as ministers, is to provide the Dharma. And that is the gift that we are giving. We're providing teachings to lay people, and it's sort of a way for us to give back for all the generosity that we have received. Now, going back again to the idea of perfect giving, this is, in its truest sense, we say, fully able to be accomplished by only bodhisattvas and Buddhas, because they give not only the gift of the pure Dharma, because they truly understand it in their enlightened states. They have the perfect wisdom to know the exact words or the exact actions to give in any situation. Another gift that they give, and I always love this one, is the gift of fearlessness. Before becoming a Buddha, a bodhisattva will make vows to ensure that all beings will attain Buddhahood. And in this way, they are trying to calm our fears. They are trying to give us a sense of ease and a way out of our troubled states of mind. So even in the Sanbutsuge, which we chanted today, the Bodhisattva Dharmakara is expressing in this chant the wish to save all beings. And one of the lines says, "On becoming a Buddha, I will fulfill these vows, and to all those who live in fear, I will give great peace." Now, this, when he is talking about this, is saying that we do have fear in our lives. We have troublesome states of mind, and it may not be fear like I get when I see a clown, or when we are in like a spooky haunted house. That's totally fear, and also kind of irrational. But we have all kinds of fears, right? We have family members. Again, Reverend Kory mentioned that I've got a daughter, and many of us have children or grandchildren or people that we love that we worry about. My daughter lives in Washington State right now, and so it's a long way away. And I know that it's wonderful that she's out, she's doing the adulting thing and becoming her own person, but I'm her mommy, so I do worry. I worry about all kinds of things, what could happen. And these are fears, and these are normal fears, and part of that gift of fearlessness that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are trying to provide for us is just the idea to, it's okay, you're going to have those fears, so don't run away from them, don't let them run away with you, don't make it something that you are so constantly worried about, but look at that fear, take a little moment, why am I scared? Is this something that I should be so all consumed with, or is it something as simple as, oh, I heard something on the news, and think that it's all pervasive, when if we stop and look for a moment, we see that maybe it was an isolated incident, or maybe this is something we don't need to worry about quite as much as we think, but it's a matter of gaining that wisdom. And this is part of the gift of fearlessness that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas give. So when we talk about Amida, we say that Amida is fully enlightened Buddha, having fulfilled the vows that were made reiterated in the Sanbutsuge. They radiate this great wisdom and compassion throughout the universe. They radiate this gift of the Dharma, this gift of foolishness. That's my gift, apparently. But they radiate the gift of fearlessness. And even when we look at Amida-sama here on the Naichin, we can see all of the radiation, the reminder that this wisdom compassion is coming at us constantly. It's a dynamic action. It's something that is calling to us at all times to kind of assuage our fears, to bring us this great peace. And again, when we look, and sometimes it's hard to see from out in the Gejin there, but everything that this Buddha symbolizes, there are the rays behind the Buddha's head. There are 48 of those, each representing one of those vows that was made and fulfilled. The bright color of the Buddha is that perfect gold, that radiation of great wisdom. And even the mudra, the hand symbols, are signs of that great compassion and also that gift of fearlessness. So one hand is up like this. This is a calming gesture, reminding us that everything is okay. We are who we are. We live very human lives. It's going to be okay. On the other hand, it's down here and it's in this kind of shape. That's a pushing gesture. When we talk about wisdom, compassion, we talk about them as verbs. They are dynamic action, constantly working in our lives. And so this little gesture here, however you think of it as the Buddha bowling all of us down with this wisdom and compassion, pushing it towards us constantly. Now again, today's service is dedicated to the Fujinkai, the BWA. And again, the Fujinkai has dedicated itself to these principles, the idea of dana, or selfless giving. We have promotion, of course, of Buddhist women's programs. They have supported all of the Buddhist youth and contribute to the welfare of not only the temple community, but associations outside. And again, formed kind of the backbones of our temples. We talk about the story of the Buddha and sort of like the sweet Sujata who met the Buddha on the road when he was about to die, and she fed him and nurtured him back to health. The BWA is like Sujata. They nourish us, they bring us to health, and they make sure that we are continuing to run. And this has been well over 100 years now. Now these days, of course, the organization is expanding. At our temple in Denver, we have men who kind of help out with our organization, and they have decided to make it sort of the Buddhist Dana Association, including all types of people, and expanding our efforts to organizations outside of the temple. But we still are the backbone here. Now, Jodo Shinshu, of course, as we know, because we're doing the memorial, has a long tradition of devoted women leaders. Now, Shinran's wife, Esshinni, we decided to put her all the way at the left, right? she's the woman on the far side. Esshinni was kind of, we see her as, obviously we know, she was the wife of Shinran Shonin and sort of the mother of Jodo Shinshu. Through the writings that she left, she was obviously very devoted to not only her husband, Shinran, but also to the teachings that he was busy propagating throughout his life. And again, her letters give sort of personal testimony more than anything about what the lives of she and her husband looked like and the lives of people at the time. And they were found in the Honganji archives around 1922. And again, we take to them because they do give us a good idea of what was going on at the time. But she also writes things like, one of my favorite stories within those is that she had a dream one time of her husband and her husband's great teacher, Honen. And they were outside of a temple, and her husband was on the side where the Bodhisattva of great compassion is, and his teacher Honen was on the side of the Bodhisattva of great wisdom. And in this way, she said that she saw her husband best. She saw him as somebody who had great compassion, someone who was spreading the teachings. And I like that story because on the other side, there's a story of Shinran having a dream before he left his studies at the temple that he was at when he was a small child. And the dream that he had was also of the Bodhisattva of compassion in the form of a woman, because he was questioning, what do I do with my life? I'm not sure if I want to continue with my studies. And in this dream, the Bodhisattva of compassion comes to him again as a woman and says to him that If you cannot continue your life in this way, remove yourself from the temple, go down into the world, and I will be with you the whole time. So I like both of these dreams because to me, the way I read it is that both Esshinni and Shinran saw themselves or saw each other mutually as bodhisattvas of great compassion. They saw each other in a way that you are helping me through this life, and together we can do this. We also, of course, are honoring his youngest daughter, Kakushi-sama. Now, she is important to us because she established Shinran's pilgrimage site. So the site that we now have as the core of our organization was a place that after Shinran died, Kakushini erected a place there as a pilgrimage site for his followers to come together and talk about the teachings. Now, she was the first caretaker of this site, and again, sort of erected where we are at the core of our Jodo Shinshu organization. And it is said that all of the Gomonshu, all of the heads of the organization, have come through her own bloodline. A lot of dudes there, not women, but she was the beginning of that. So obviously these two women were instrumental in keeping the teachings of Shinran Shonin alive, and as a result, of course, we are able to receive them today. Now, spring ahead many, many, many years from Esshinni and Kakushini, we also pay reverence to Lady Takeko Kujo, who is sort of the founder of our Buddhist women's organization. She was the daughter of the 21st caretaker of the Honganji, Koso no Tani. And she, along with her sister-in-law, founded the organization in 1904 during the Russo-Japanese War. To do this, she connected women from different temples and Buddhist organizations, and she got them together so that they could send care packages to the soldiers at the front, and also locally to take care of the families who had lost sons or loved ones in the war. In 1920, she helped to found Kyoto Women's University, which is an institution of higher learning, obviously, for women that was based in Buddhist philosophy. She also sponsored many, many humanitarian efforts after the Kanto earthquake of 1923 and helped to rebuild the Tsukiji Honganji. Now in 1925, the Honganji established a free clinic in Tokyo to serve the poor. Lady Kujo raised money to keep it operating at a time when it had lost its funding. Now this clinic eventually became the Ashoka Hospital, which means without sorrow. And it was one of Japan's first medical centers and still operates today. She also wrote many, many books, well, many, many essays and poems, and that includes the Gatha that we sang today, Seiya. And they're collected, but she took the sales from her book to keep this Ashoka Hospital running. And even when it was in times of great turmoil, it became incorporated officially as a hospital 2 years after her death, even though it had been there and running for many, many years. Now, sadly, she died of sepsis at the age of 41 in 1928. She had been working with victims of the Kanto earthquake and had contracted sepsis at the time. So through all of her work, she really worked herself to death, worked herself to the bone for the benefit of all people. And again, this is the spirit of the BWA that continues today, the spirit of Dharma. Now again, when we talk about Dharma, there is that aspect of it, the perfect giving, the giving without calculation, that you do not expect something in return. But once again, very, very difficult for all of us to accomplish. Even as an organization that is dedicated to ensuring that we are helping others, assisting others with everything, we still have to remember that we are very human. It's okay if you like to receive praise for the work that you've done. Who doesn't? That's always really nice. And yes, it can feel a little bad when we don't get that thank you or that appreciation, but that's okay too. Because the quote I opened with, for example, is from Shinran's Hymns of Lament and Reflection. And Shinran Shonin, as we know through his teachings, thought himself incapable of true acts of Dharma. Again, he saw himself as the foolish, bald-headed one, someone who was just human with all of the messiness, all of the bada-bada of our lives that goes with that. Human life is kind of messy, and we can't have perfection. And again, in seeking that perfection or expecting that perfection, we can cause ourselves more trouble, more troublesome states of mind, or as we say in Buddhism, more suffering, because we're not going to get there. We're kind of imperfect. We give when we can, but we feel good about it, and we like to feel good about it. That's okay. That's very human. We offer what we can, and again, even if it's, quote, tainted with a little bit of calculation, that's okay, because we are just human. However, that also, with Shinran, and so for ourselves, this should not be something that discourages us. Because when we come to a point where we start to understand that we are just human, we remember that, and we remember that it's okay. We can come to temple, we can see Amida-sama and be reminded, though the Buddha is enlightened, we are not, but oh, what's he saying? That's okay, it's going to be fine. And we can be remembered that, oh, other hand, he's shooting that wisdom, compassion at us, to be reminded that, yes, wisdom, compassion, we should share with others. We should give that gift as well, but also give that gift to ourselves a little bit, because we forget that too. The wisdom and compassion, it's all enfolding. That means everybody outside of us, but also us. And Shinran often said, believed very strongly that that light of Amida Buddha was always shining on us, no matter how foolish he himself was, no matter how foolish we are. This was something that propelled him on to continue to give that gift of Dharma to others, and is now a reminder to us to give that to other people and again to ourselves. So today, once again, we are celebrating the contributions of countless women who came before us, women who have served the temples with this loving dana. And in our reflections, it's my hope that, of course, we can not only appreciate what the BWA has done and will continue to do for all of us, but hopefully that will encourage others to join, that through our spirit, because we too can emit that shining light when they see us helping as much as we can or working in the spirit of Dana. It might encourage others to join along with us and to help out. Again, we remember that we are all fellow travelers. We are carried on the ship of Amida's vow of great wisdom and compassion. And even if we might feel that our contributions were small or maybe not as much as we wanted to, no matter how small it is, our actions may be providing that gift of fearlessness in some small way. That reminder that it's going to be okay. And in that way, we can continue the spirit of Dana for everyone else. So thank you all again for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I look forward to talking to you all at lunch. And we'll go ahead and close with Kansho. Lacking even small love and small compassion, I cannot hope to benefit sentient beings. Were it not for the ship of Amida's vow, how could I cross the ocean of painful existence? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida.
Namo
Namo Amida.
Namo
Thank you so much, Reverend Thompson, for your message. Please rise for our final Gatha, Ondokusan, on page 58 in the draft book.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida
Namo Amida Butsu.